Today's episode of Opposable Digits is about the mass shooting in Bondi, the Australian media response in the immediate aftermath of that shooting, and attempting to combat antisemitism in Australia without silencing criticisms of Israel. There are not very many jokes in this episode. If you're having a bad day, maybe save it and have a listen later. To be completely honest, I didn't have a fun time making it, and you probably won't have a fun time listening to it. If that isn't discouragement enough, well, I hope you get whatever you've come for. On with the show. Hello and welcome to Opposable Digits. I'm Justin MacArthur. Today marks 1 month since the Bondi Beach shooting on the 14th of December 2025. At approximately 6:47 p.m, 2 gunmen shot into the crowd at a Hanukkah celebration in Bondi. 15 people were killed and at least 42 more were injured. It is the deadliest terror incident in Australia's history and the second deadliest mass shooting in Australia in nearly a century. According to the New South Wales Police Commissioner, the shooters were a father and son. The father was an Indian national from Hyderabad who had emigrated to Australia in 1998. The son was an Australian citizen born in Australia in 2001. Evidence has come out over the past month indicating that both men had been radicalised by the Islamic State, ISIS, and were trained by ISIS in the Philippines prior to the attack. Now, I'm not going to be mentioning the names of the attackers in line with common practice for shooting events, but I mention these details because there were a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of false identifications made of these shooters, so I just wanted to explain why I'm doing that. This might be the hardest thing I've ever recorded. Like many tragedies, this shooting highlighted the worst of humanity, but also the best. Alex Claytman, an 87-year-old Holocaust survivor, died shielding his wife. Reuven Morrison, 62 years old, died throwing bricks at the gunman. Ahmed Al-Ahmed, a 43-year-old fruit vendor, tackled one of the shooters and wrestled away his gun and has become a national hero. Lifeguards from the Bondi Surf Lifesaving Club ran into the stream of bullets to deliver medical supplies and used surfboards as stretchers before ambulances could arrive. And Australians across the country responded so quickly to calls to donate blood that the Red Cross website crashed, and at some sites, walk-in donors had to be turned away. Broadly, this has been a story of Australians coming together. We could have been paralysed by the confusing politics, by the senseless violence, and instead, most Australians said this is a time for grieving and rebuilding and pouring out love for each other. That was most of us. But alongside those looking to grieve and rebuild in healthy ways, there are also people that grieve by latching onto misinformation, and of course there are grifters and opportunists looking to prey on those victims and profit from that grief. On the left side of politics, one of the things that made me most angry in the days following the Bondi shootings was the conspiracy theory that this was somehow orchestrated by Australian right-wing groups or by Israel as a false flag attack. They say that the attackers were pretending to be radicalised by ISIS, but actually working for the IDF or Mossad or ASIO. This is just disgusting. I mean, for the obvious reasons, but also because the intention of the conspiracy is to pretend that this is a controversial political issue where reasonable people can disagree. It implies that some Australians don't care as much as others, or worse, that their pain isn't real. Some proponents of this conspiracy even made AI pictures pretending to show real victims of the attack on a film set, having fake blood applied by makeup artists. Now, I'm not going to spend any time actually speaking about this conspiracy, debunking this conspiracy, because it's just nonsense, and the good news is that a month on, it's mostly disappeared. I haven't seen anyone claiming this conspiracy is real for at least a couple of weeks now, but just to state the facts we know, because they are important. The 2 shooters were radicalised by ISIS, and more locally in Australia by a Sydney preacher called Wissam Haddad, who was prosecuted for hate speech in July 2025 and investigated by ASIO, Australia's National Security and Intelligence Agency, in relation to other hate crimes. There is a clear paper trail connecting the shooters to violent Islamic extremism. And you may ask, why that evidence has only been put together after this tragedy. Certainly one of the most important takeaways is that government agencies responsible for national security need to actually talk to one another. The New South Wales Police approved a gun licence renewal in 2020 for the father, a man whose son had been investigated by ASIO in 2019. The man appeared to have been trained by ISIS in the Philippines only a month before the attacks, a country with which they had no prior association and where ISIS-affiliated jihadists have been conducting training since at least March 2016. There is no evidence that ASIO had been monitoring them or had any awareness of this trip, which obviously would have raised red flags given their past. So, no. The Israel false flag conspiracy is clearly nonsense. Even if you harbour some anti-Israeli sentiment at the moment, and in my opinion you should have some anti-Israel sentiment because according to every international body, they are perpetrating a genocide in Gaza and the West Bank, Israel is not responsible for this terrorist attack on the Australian Jewish community in Bondi. And if the Australian media and political classes were being responsible about how they talk about this tragedy, that would be the end of the conversation. But the reason I believe this conspiracy theory appeals to people is there is a lingering feeling of premeditation to how the government and press have handled Bondi. And this is where I turn to the right-wing grifters. Because while Australians throughout the country and the world reeled from this tragedy, while Jews feared for their safety, particularly at Hanukkah events running the same night, some of which had to be cancelled, the media class were sitting and preparing their sound bites and their think pieces. To pull back the curtain for a moment, what really spurred me to put together this episode was watching the coverage of Bondi unfold in real time on social media. Because if there's one thing that the Australian media is good at, it's generating outrage out of nothing. But what will that outrage machine do faced with an event that is already outrageous, that already offends every decent person's sensibilities, that is already beyond the worst that many of us could have imagined? Well, a week after the events, I started writing this script because it started right away. I'm going to be honest, I don't really want to do this episode. I don't know that anyone wants to hear what I have to say about this. But I've done the research, so I'm going to put it out there. If it's useful to anyone, I hope it is. If it's not, just stop. Just walk away. You don't need to put yourself through every political thing. When I initially saw how the media were covering what was happening in Bondi, I went, I have to document it. I have to keep a record of it. So that's what I did. Anyway, I'm going to make a cup of tea. I'm going to put this down in my office. The shooting took place at 6:47 p.m. At 9:55 p.m, just 3 hours after the shooting, Murdoch's flagship Australian newspaper, The Australian, posted its first criticism of the government for the evening. Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who earlier in 2025 described all Palestinian civilians as Nazis and said of Israel's blockade of food, water and electricity, "I'm not going to feed electricity to my enemies," said the writing was on the wall prior to the Bondi Beach attack. "We saw it coming," said Bennett. The Australian federal and local government was feeble, was weak, and did not act against this huge wave of antisemitism, even though time and time again they were urged to do so. Again, this was 3 hours and 8 minutes after the shooting. To borrow some sensationalist language that the Australian I'm sure would love to print, the blood had literally not dried in Archer Park. At 11:18 p.m. on Sunday, 4.5 hours after the shooting, The Australian posted its second criticism of Albanese for the evening, this time from Peter Dutton, Australia's least popular major party leader in 40 years. Peter Dutton described the massacre as inevitable and referred to it as a day of national shame. At 6:55 a.m. the following morning, The Australian, having had a night to think, kicked off the day with Israeli politicians saying Albanese had blood on his hands. And then at 7:47 a.m. came the first of their full-length opinion pieces, the ever-reliable Chris Kenny, a former Liberal Party Chief of Staff and current Sky News presenter. Publicly and privately, I have begged Anthony Albanese to confront this anti-Semitic scourge. What can he do now to overcome 2 years of indolence and cowardice? How many more people will suffer? Wrote Chris Kenny. Exactly 13 hours had passed since the deadliest terror attack in Australian history. This was followed by an editorial at 9:45 a.m. called "The Bondi Attack Has Changed Our Nation Beyond Recognition." Quote, "The signs of anti-Semitism began more than 2 years ago at the Opera House, but the ineptitude of officialdom set a pattern for appalling scenes to come." This is where we start to see the Australians' party line forming. This tragedy, a shooting in which 15 people were killed, is merely the natural consequence of allowing people to peacefully protest Australia's support for Israel outside the Sydney Opera House in 2023. Anti-Israel protesters, some of whom were allegedly shouting anti-Semitic slogans, absolutely, were somehow responsible for allowing 2 men to be radicalised by ISIS and trained by a paramilitary group in the Philippines. If you're willing to believe these associations, then all of this commentary starts to make sense. For example, the next opinion piece at 11:15 a.m. on Monday. "No more weasel words. Albanese must be a leader. The time for weasel words and conflation from Labor is over. The time to unleash every power and asset against those who want to harm innocent Australians is now." At 3 p.m. on Monday, Australia faces international shame after gunmen targeted a Jewish festival at Bondi, marking the country as an anti-Semitic terror hotbed. At 3:46 p.m, Benjamin Netanyahu has accused the Albanese government of pouring fuel on this anti-Semitic fire, condemning Australia for failing to stamp out hatred in the lead-up to the murders of Jewish people on Bondi Beach. There we go, 24 hours have passed. I just want to put that flag there. 24 hours have passed since the shooting. At 9:15 p.m, cancel culture is like the Inquisition of the Middle Ages. That one's actually not about Bondi, but it is by Steven Pinker, who I'd like to point out has been cancelled because of his association with Jeffrey Epstein, including his involvement in Epstein's legal defence, just to place some other opinion pieces in there. Tuesday morning. We saw this coming. We warned that anti-Jewish rhetoric, disguised as war criticism, would pave the way for violence. Now, as the intifada you globalized arrives, spare us your feigned surprise and condolences. You built this intifada, so spare us your shock and save your prayers. This article was by a guy called Yoni Bashan, who was awarded News Corp's Internal Journalist of the Year award in 2024 for being the first Australian journalist to visit Gaza following the October 7th attacks. Yoni's column was accompanied by a 4-panel cartoon, and I think this cartoon best illustrates the chain of logic here. In the top left, the Sydney Opera House protests in October 2023, featuring what appears to be the Sydney Opera House on fire. Notably, the Sydney Opera House was not set on fire. Flares were lit during the protest, and again, people did chant anti-Semitic slogans. There is a very imposing photo of flames in front of the Opera House, but there were no arrests over the flares, no one was injured. Certainly the building itself did not catch fire. In the top right of the image, the Adass Israel Synagogue, a Melbourne synagogue that was set on fire in December 2024. In August 2025, ASIO concluded that the government of Iran was involved in planning the attack, as well as a related arson attack on a Jewish kosher restaurant in Bondi 2 months earlier. As a result, Prime Minister Albanese expelled the Iranian ambassador to Australia from the country and suspended operations of Australia's embassy in Tehran. So to be really clear on this point, these arson attacks were direct attacks on Australian Jewish people because of their faith, and because of the perceived connection between their faith and the government of Israel. I have no doubt that these attacks spread fear among Australian Jews and increased their concern about anti-Semitism in the broader Australian public. But the two arson attacks were not because of general anti-Semitism in the Australian community. They were not committed by pro-Palestine protesters. They were politically motivated terrorist attacks orchestrated by the government of Iran. The pattern that is trying to be established in this cartoon does not work if you understand that context. Nevertheless, the cartoon continues. In the bottom left, the Sydney Harbour Bridge in a murky grey. There's actually no criticism in this bit of the image. It's just an image of a protest on a bridge. And actually, it's sort of a counter to their argument because it's, tens of thousands of people at the lowest estimates protesting peacefully with no violence. But underneath the two pictures of buildings on fire, it continues to establish a pattern. Anti-Semitism is growing, the Australian would like to allege. And finally, in the bottom right, Anthony Albanese in front of the beach at Bondi saying, "There is no place for anti-Semitism in this country." Now, you would think, again, that that is counter to the previous images, but this is intended as a humorous juxtaposition, intended to imply that Anthony Albanese doesn't really care about the scenes behind him at Bondi Beach. He doesn't care about anti-Semitism. He loves it. He's fine with egging it on. Tuesday morning. At this point, 36 hours have passed since the deadliest terror event in Australia's history, and the Murdoch press have already decided their conclusions. The Bondi shooting was not a false flag. The suggestion that anyone knew this was coming and did nothing is repulsive. It's disgusting, let alone the idea that they planned it and helped to orchestrate it. But the reactionary press did plan in advance for something like this. They have been waiting with bated breath for any reason to escalate their rhetoric around Israel and anti-Semitism, in line with the political point scoring and subsequent government crackdowns on protests in the United States and the United Kingdom. Theirs is a unified worldview that will proceed without regard to new information, new facts. It's news, in a sense, but without anything new. The opinions underlying the reporting were formed months ago, years ago. The reason they could publish these opinions so quickly is because they didn't have to think about them, because they had already formed them before the attack took place. They merely put new events into the context of what they already believed. The Australian was right about one thing, of course. The Bondi attack has changed our nation beyond recognition. But their columnists and pundits didn't have time to think about how it would change our nation before they started publishing opinions. They didn't want to spend time thinking. They wanted their opinions to be the first on the ground. That's where my script ended a month ago. A month on from the attack, it seems like this strategy worked from the Australian and from members of the Australian right. The government, battered and bruised, appears to have said, okay, we'll have a royal commission into anti-Semitism. Can we calm things down now? Can we come together? And in the wake of those headlines, it's really, what other option did they have? But a royal commission into anti-Semitism is not going to be the answer. Because let me repeat this point. While the Islamic State is obviously anti-Semitic, alongside everything else that's wrong with the Islamic State, this attack was not caused by general anti-Semitism in the Australian community. And in the meantime, smothering protest, silencing dissent when a genocide is definitively taking place in Israel is not going to douse the flames of anti-Semitism that do flicker in the worst parts of our activist communities. This is not to say the Australian Jewish community has anything to do with what's happening in Israel, but making our response to anti-Semitism against Australian Jews about Israel does. It does draw a link. That is the scary thing. The federal government is meeting next week, on January 19th and 20th, in an emergency session to redefine what hate speech means in Australia. The bill has not yet been released to the public, but the ABC reported today, at time of recording, that it will create a new federal offence, making it, quote, illegal to publicly promote or incite racial hatred where the conduct would cause a reasonable person to feel intimidated, harassed, or fear violence. On paper, this sounds good. This doesn't sound like the things that I'm a bit scared that the hate speech bill will come to look like. It seems like it might be narrow enough to avoid adverse consequences. It remains to be seen, but I hope that's the case. But needless to say, this does come in the context not only of Bondi, but also many years of confrontations between artists and censors operating in the name of the Australian Jewish community, shutting down criticism of Israel. Most recently, writers' festivals in both Bendigo and Adelaide falling apart because of cancelled writers. And it's important to highlight that in Adelaide's case, it wasn't even because of someone's criticism of Israel, it was because they were Palestinian at all, at least in the public statements issued by the Adelaide Festival Board. In her resignation as director of Adelaide Writers' Week, Louise Adler cites many examples of arts events that have been cancelled, shut down, altered in some way in order to supposedly protect the Australian Jewish community, but actually to shut down criticism of Israel.
I think this is a landmark, a watershed moment in the history of Adelaide Writers' Week, but it is of a piece with all the other issues that we've seen unfold in the last few years in the arts community. Whether we're talking about Khaled Sabsabi at Creative Australia, whether we're talking about the MSO and Jason Gillam, whether we're talking about Bendigo Writers' Week, we've had a succession of dramas of this sort where political interference and donors and lobby groups have been able to come in and have an influence and an effect on what is programmed and what is not programmed.
The acceptance of Israeli government funding by the Sydney Festival in 2022, the sanctioning of young actors in Kefirs at the Sydney Theatre Company, the State Library of Victoria's cancellation of a teen writing program, and of course, the collapse of both the Bendigo and Adelaide Writers' Festivals. That's quite a list. I'm not going to weigh in on changes to hate speech laws directly, but I would like to draw your attention to our existing hate speech laws and how they've been interpreted by the courts. I mentioned earlier that the two men that committed the attack in Bondi were radicalised by a Sydney preacher called Wissam Haddad, who was prosecuted for hate speech in July 2025. More specifically, he was found to be fundamentally racist and anti-Semitic, portraying Jewish people as, quote, wicked, scheming, vile, mischievous, and descendants of apes and pigs. This is obviously anti-Semitic speech. It's right that he was prosecuted for it. He deserves all the fines and jail time and whatever else that he gets for that. The court, though, also looked at the same preacher's criticisms of Israel, Zionism, and the actions of the IDF in Gaza. And in the same breath as condemning anti-Semitism, we should heed these rulings of the courts also. And I'm going to read straight from the ABC coverage back in July 2025 here. The court found passages in an interview and sermon by Mr. Haddad contained critical and disparaging things about the actions of the Israel Defense Forces in Gaza and about Zionists. However, the judge found the ordinary, reasonable listener would not understand these things to be about Jewish people in general. That person would understand that not all Jews are Zionists and that disparagement of Zionism constitutes disparagement of a philosophy or ideology and not a race or ethnic group. Political criticism of Israel, however inflammatory or adversarial, is not by its nature criticism of Jews in general or based on Jewish racial or ethnic identity. The conclusion that it is not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel is the corollary of the conclusion that to blame Jews for the actions of Israel is anti-Semitic. The one flows from the other. And I'm just going to unpack that quickly. So a corollary being kind of the inverse of the argument that is proven in the same statement. If to blame Jews for the actions of Israel is anti-Semitic because they're not one and the same, and that's kind of the hidden premise here, then it is not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel because they're not one and the same. It is not the same as criticizing Jewish people or accusing Jewish people in general of something to criticize Israel because they are not the same entity. I just wanted to kind of unpack that little argument there. One thing that the Islamic State shares with the nation of Israel is a desire to extend the field of conflict so that Jewish Australians see themselves as threatened Israelis. That is how they extend the conflict to our shores. That is how they rally more people to their cause internationally and make this the big religious conflict that they would both like it to be. I'm aware that I'm both sidesing a little bit here, but I hope that my intention is clear. We should not allow ourselves, in my opinion, to become the instruments of these radicalizing forces. Our compassion, our unity, and most importantly, our instinctive decision to defend the weak is our strength. Whether that's standing up to an attacker, running into gunfire to deliver medical supplies, or giving our own blood from thousands of kilometers away. That is the unifying influence here. It is my belief that the violence of both of these groups will fail unless we become its instrument, unless we turn on each other in the wake of a tragedy like this. That's the end of the episode. This has been the hardest thing I've ever written. I really hope I've done it justice. I hope that by presenting the facts the way I have, you can make up your own mind about who is doing bad stuff because they're evil and who's just trying to make the best of a bad situation. I generally think that most people are in that latter camp, but I still definitely want to call out irresponsible journalism and the way that our media environment, at least in the early days, worsened our country's response to the crisis.
The number you have dialed is not in service at this time.
Having opposable digits helps in grasping things.
Please now go and listen to something that's a lot nicer, treat yourself well, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks for listening.